This week I read a truly incredible Washington Post headline. Study, kids who vape tobacco are more likely to go on to use cannabis. That headline inspired two thoughts to pop into my head almost at the same time. Number one, literally no kids are vaping tobacco. And two, if they are, and then they move on to cannabis, that's good. That's a good thing. Let's get into it. First of all, yeah, the headline is just embarrassing. It's got vibes of, are kids injecting cannabis? Kids don't vape tobacco. No one does. They smoke tobacco. They vape nicotine. Tobacco is the substance found in cigarettes and cigars, which contain thousands of chemicals, including very harmful carcinogenic things like formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide. They also contain nicotine, which is the extremely addictive drug that lifts your mood, makes you poop, fucks up your heart, and wears off really quickly, making you crave another cigarette within a few hours of that first one, if not sooner. You can vape tobacco if you really want. You can drop a few $100s on a vaporizer. I have one just for funsies. It'll turn any dry vegetation into a mist that you can breathe into your lungs. But no one is doing that to tobacco because it's going to taste like absolute shit, and it's still going to put all of those harmful chemicals into your body that you don't really need. Instead, if you just want the happy-making poop drug, it makes more sense to just drop $10 on a little cartridge that only contains nicotine, ideally. Maybe a few bonus chemicals that make it taste interesting. I'm going to pause here to point out that this is not the first time I've discussed nicotine vaping. Last year, I talked about Juul, which is the behemoth vape company that's owned in part by the same company that sells you Marlboro cigarettes. Juul bought an entire science journal to publish a bunch of laudatory bullshit about, how great vaping is. You should go watch that video if you haven't seen it to get a good idea of how completely sociopathic this entire industry is. But just know that while vaping nicotine is surely less dangerous than smoking cigarettes, it's still bad for you. And Juul has marketed their vapes to children, as I mentioned in that video, via outlets like Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, and 17 Magazine. So while kids are not vaping tobacco, as this idiotic headline states, kids are vaping nicotine that is being advertised to them. And that is super not good. If we fix the bad headline, that means what they're saying is a study shows that kids who vape nicotine are more likely to go on to use cannabis. The assumption here is that nicotine vapes are a gateway to cannabis, and the Washington Post reporter even spells that out in the opening of the article. Vaping is growing more prevalent among young people. In 2021, 1 in 9 high school students said they had vaped in the past month, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Increasingly, those kids are vaping cannabis, but is vaping a gateway to marijuana use? A new study suggests that is the case. No, it doesn't suggest that at all. But briefly, let me say that if it were true, if it were true that the kids were switching from nicotine to cannabis, that would be a good thing, just from a harm reduction standpoint, Let me be clear, kids should not be using cannabis. It's probably not good for their still developing brains. But from a harm reduction standpoint, cannabis is probably better for them than nicotine. So okay. However, it's actually not true that this study shows that nicotine vapes are a gateway to kids using cannabis. And I know because unlike the people at the Washington Post who wrote that headline and the article, I actually read this study. And you can too. Use of electronic cigarettes among cannabis-naive adolescents and its association with future cannabis use was published last month in the American Medical Association's monthly open access journal. The researchers looked at an existing database of about 10,000 American adolescents. That's kids aged 12 to 17 at the start of the study. And these kids, at the start of the study in 2017, had never tried cannabis, but some of them had tried e-cigarettes, vaping nicotine. A year or two later, the same group was surveyed again, and the researchers noted how many had now tried cannabis specifically looking to see if there was a difference between those who had already tried vaping e-cigs. 900 kids in the second survey had now tried cannabis in the year since the first survey, so about 10% of all of the kids. Those who had previously tried vaping nicotine, which was less than 8% of the initial group, were about 3 times as likely to be in that 10% that ended up trying cannabis later. So, does that mean vaping increases the chances that a kid will try cannabis? No. In fact, the same study authors state very clearly that this is not what's happening. Despite this association, e-cigarette use seems to have had a minimal association with the overall prevalence of youth cannabis use. At the population level, adolescent use of cannabis has remained relatively stable for the past quarter century. And consider this. In that second wave of surveys, only 244 kids had used e-cigs and then went on to use cannabis. But 365 had used alcohol in the past year and then went on to use cannabis. 612 had C grades or lower in school and went on to try cannabis. And the kids who were more likely to try both e-cigarettes and cannabis also scored higher on sensation seeking, which was the mean response to 3 questions which asked about respondents' affinity for frightening things, new and exciting experiences, and exciting and unpredictable friends. The study authors even admit that after controlling for sensation seeking, it's likely that e-cigarette use may be a marker for other risk-taking behaviors that are also associated with cannabis use. So if the takeaway from this study is not e-cigarettes are a gateway to more kids using cannabis, which it's not, then what is the takeaway? Simple. Big tobacco companies like Juul have successfully marketed their products to bad kids. Kids who are more likely to drink, smoke weed, and get bad grades are now also more likely to vape highly addictive nicotine pods. The same number of kids used cannabis in 2019 as did in 1995, but fewer kids are smoking cigarettes these days, which led the tobacco industry to strike back with vapes. In fact, the exact same team of researchers that published this article also published this article last year in the exact same journal, JAMA Open Access, and they point this out. In 2020, 1.6% of middle school students and 4.6% of high school students reported use of cigarettes in the past 30 days, compared with 12.8% of middle school students and 34.8% of high school students in 1999. In contrast, the popularity of e-cigarettes has increased markedly among adolescents in recent years. Since 2014, e-cigarettes have become the most commonly used nicotine or tobacco product among middle school and high school students. From 2017 to 2018, current use of e-cigarettes, defined as having vaped in the past 30 days, increased from 11.7% to 20.8% among high school students, and from 3.3% to 4.9% among middle school students. The rates grew even higher in 2019 at 27.5% among high school students and 10.5% among middle school students. In 2020, the researchers point out that the numbers actually started to drop a bit, maybe thanks to stricter laws stopping companies like Juul from marketing their e-cigarettes directly to children. And that's great. I think more people need to realize how absolutely sociopathic these big tobacco companies are, but not in the way that the Washington Post has done by using outdated anti-cannabis fear-mongering. You know, the truth of the matter is that kids who have experimented with drugs are going to continue to experiment with whatever drugs they can get. And especially those drugs that are marketed directly to them and made very easy for them to get. So maybe instead of worrying about cannabis, we stop doing that.